What if I told you that the First World War was not only fought in the trenches of France, but in deserts, jungles, frozen lakes, secret rooms, and even inside the minds of leaders who barely understood the forces they had unleashed? What if the war you think you know, the mud, the barbed wire, the machine guns, hides stories rarely told? In this video, we will uncover 20 little-discussed, fascinating facts about World War I, from silent Christmas truces and underground cities to forgotten invasions, psychological warfare, secret propaganda machines, and the strange chain reactions that reshaped the entire modern world. This is not the usual story of the Great War. This is what history often leaves between the lines. It's great to have you here. If you enjoy these war journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought in the comments below. This helps others find their way here too. For now, let's begin our journey. When the war erupted in the summer of 1914, Europe did not slide into chaos, it sprinted. Governments mobilized millions in days. Trains ran on precise schedules that had been prepared for years. In Germany, the Schlieffen Plan was so rigid that once activated, it could barely be altered. And here lies our first rarely discussed truth. The war escalated not just because leaders wanted it, but because their own mobilization timetables trapped them. The railway schedules became chains. Once Russia began mobilizing against Austria-Hungary after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Germany felt compelled to activate its own plan. In Berlin, General Helmuth von Moltke the Younger reportedly confessed that once the order was given, the machinery rolled on by itself. The war was not only a political decision, it was a mechanical inevitability. Fact 2 takes us far from the Western Front, to a place many forget was part of the war, Africa. While the trenches of France dominate memory, German colonial forces in East Africa, led by General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, conducted one of the most remarkable guerrilla campaigns of the entire war. With a relatively small force of German officers and African Askari soldiers, Lettow-Vorbeck tied down over 300,000 Allied troops. He was never truly defeated in battle. In fact, he only surrendered after hearing of Germany's defeat in Europe. His campaign stretched across modern-day Tanzania, Mozambique, and Kenya. The African theater caused massive suffering among local populations, with famine and disease killing hundreds of thousands, a tragedy rarely highlighted in mainstream accounts. The third overlooked reality: the war did not begin everywhere in August 1914. In the Pacific and Asia, colonial forces moved quickly to seize German possessions. Japan, honoring its alliance with Britain, declared war on Germany and captured the German stronghold of Tsingtao in China. The siege of Tsingtao in 1914 was a preview of modern siege warfare, involving naval bombardments and early aircraft reconnaissance. Yet few today associate Imperial Japan with the First World War, even though its participation would strengthen its position in East Asia, planting seeds for future conflicts decades later. Now imagine this: Christmas Eve 1914, mud-filled trenches, the smell of cordite still in the air, and then singing. Along parts of the Western Front, German soldiers began singing Stille Nacht. British soldiers responded with Silent Night. What followed became one of the extraordinary episodes in military history, the Christmas truce. Men who had tried to kill each other hours earlier climbed out of their trenches, exchanged cigarettes, chocolate, and even played football in no man's land. Letters from British soldier Bruce Bairnsfather describe how not a shot was fired all night. It was spontaneous, unauthorized, and deeply human. High commands on both sides were horrified. Orders were issued to prevent such fraternization again. The war machine demanded hatred. But for one brief moment, the soldiers remembered they were human. Another rarely discussed fact: the war introduced industrialized psychological warfare. The British established Wellington House, a secret propaganda bureau that recruited writers like Arthur Conan Doyle and Rudyard Kipling to shape public opinion. Atrocities, some real, some exaggerated, were circulated to galvanize support. Stories of German soldiers cutting off children's hands in Belgium spread rapidly. While Belgium did suffer genuine atrocities during the invasion, propaganda amplified horror into powerful narrative tools. Modern mass persuasion, what we now call information warfare, took shape in these years. And then there is the forgotten invasion of Belgium itself. The Belgians' violation of Belgium neutrality was not just a military maneuver, it was a diplomatic earthquake. Britain entered the war largely because of this breach, citing its obligation to defend Belgium neutrality under the 1839 Treaty of London. But what is less discussed is the brutal German counterinsurgency campaign in Belgium. In towns like Dinant and Leuven, citizens were executed in reprisals for alleged sniper attacks. Entire sections of Leuven, including its historic university library, were burned. The destruction shocked the world and hardened Allied resolve. The war also produced one of the strangest naval battles in history, fought not in the Atlantic, but in a lake in East Africa. On Lake Tanganyika, British forces transported small motorboats across thousands of miles of jungle and railways to challenge German control of the lake. The operation was so unusual it later inspired novels and films. Tiny vessels named Mimi and Tutu managed to outmaneuver and capture larger German ships. It was a surreal naval duel in the heart of Africa, proof that World War I truly was global. In the Middle East, another overlooked reality unfolded. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers in late 1914. One of its first major offensives was against Russia in the Caucasus. The campaign ended disastrously at the Battle of Sarikamish in the winter of 1914-1915. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers froze to death in the snow before even engaging the enemy. Survivors later recalled entire units found stiff and upright in the ice. The defeat destabilized the region and deepened internal paranoia within the Ottoman leadership, a factor that would soon contribute to even darker chapters of history. Meanwhile, beneath the trenches of France, a hidden war raged underground. Both sides dug elaborate tunnel systems to plant massive explosive mines beneath enemy lines. At the Battle of Messines in 1917, British forces detonated 19 enormous mines under German positions. The explosion was reportedly heard in London. The ground itself became a weapon. Entire hills disappeared in seconds. Soldiers described the earth rising like water. This underground warfare remains one of the least visually remembered, yet most devastating aspects of the conflict. Another fact often overlooked: World War I triggered the first large-scale use of passports as mandatory travel documents. Before the war, international travel in Europe required minimal documentation, but fears of spies and saboteurs led governments to impose strict identification systems. Temporary wartime measures became permanent features of modern life. The passport system we know today was born from the paranoia of global war. And paranoia was everywhere. In Britain, German dachshunds were attacked in the streets. In the United States, sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. In Russia, St. Petersburg was renamed Petrograd to sound less Germanic. Anti-German hysteria reshaped identities and culture far from the battlefield. The war invaded daily life. Then there was the role of weather, a silent but decisive force. Heavy rains in 1914 and 1915 turned battlefields into swamps. Soldiers at Passchendaele in 1917 drowned in mud-filled shell craters. Artillery bombardments destroyed drainage systems, creating landscapes that swallowed men whole. Some veterans later wrote that mud killed as many as bullets. And let us not forget the silent front inside hospitals. Medical advances during the war were extraordinary, yet often overshadowed by horror. The development of blood transfusion techniques, mobile X-ray units pioneered by Marie Curie, and early plastic surgery led by Harold Gillies changed medicine forever. Soldiers with catastrophic facial injuries underwent reconstructive surgeries that were revolutionary for the time. The war, brutal as it was, accelerated medical science by decades. As 1915 approached, a new terror entered the battlefield: poison gas. Chlorine gas was first used by Germany at the Second Battle of Ypres. French colonial troops from Algeria were among the first victims.
Survivors described a greenish cloud drifting silently across no man's land. Men clawed at their throats as their lungs filled with fluid. Gas warfare horrified the world, yet all major powers soon developed their own chemical weapons. Gas masks became as essential as rifles. But perhaps one of the most unexpected facts is this: despite the brutality, millions of soldiers experienced long periods of boredom. Diaries from the trenches reveal endless routines: cleaning rifles, repairing sandbags, waiting. The war was often described as months of monotony punctuated by moments of terror. That psychological strain created what doctors then called shell shock, now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Thousands of men were executed for cowardice before the condition was understood. And while Europe burned, the United States initially remained neutral. But American banks were heavily invested in Allied victory. Financial ties, submarine warfare, and the infamous Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico, gradually shifted public opinion. When the U.S. finally entered the war in 1917, fresh troops tipped the balance. These are only the first pieces of a much larger mosaic: forgotten campaigns, hidden innovations, strange battles, silent tragedies, and global consequences that reshaped the 20th century. And we're just getting started. By 1916, the optimism that had fueled Europe's march to war was long dead. The conflict had hardened into something mechanical, relentless, and almost unimaginable in scale. Yet beyond the familiar names, Verdun, the Somme, there were stories unfolding in shadows, in deserts, in prison camps, and inside the minds of men and women whose roles rarely make the headlines. One of the most overlooked dimensions of the First World War was the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. While the Western Front consumed millions of lives, the sands of the Middle East became the stage for a different kind of war, one of sabotage, tribal alliances, and promises that would reshape the region. Sharif Hussein of Mecca, encouraged by British promises of Arab independence, launched an uprising in 1916. Among the British officers sent to assist was a young archaeologist turned intelligence officer, T.E. Lawrence, later immortalized as Lawrence of Arabia. But the romantic image hides a complex truth. The revolt was as much about British strategic interests, particularly securing the Suez Canal and weakening Ottoman control, as it was about Arab liberation. Letters between British officials reveal that even as promises of independence were made, secret negotiations like the Sykes-Picot Agreement were dividing the Middle East into spheres of influence. The seeds of modern geopolitical tensions were planted in these wartime deals. While men fought in trenches and deserts, women stepped into roles previously denied to them. This war became a turning point for female participation in industrial labor. In Britain, over 1 million women entered munitions factories. Known as munitionettes, they worked long hours handling toxic chemicals like TNT. The exposure turned their skin yellow, earning them the nickname canaries. Explosions in poorly ventilated factories killed hundreds, yet their labor kept armies supplied. In Russia, women went further, forming the Women's Battalion of Death in 1917 under Maria Bokareva. These women fought on the front lines to inspire demoralized male troops. Their existence shattered traditional assumptions about gender and combat, even if their contribution was later overshadowed. Another rarely discussed aspect of the war was the massive scale of prisoner of war camps. By 1918, millions of soldiers were held captive across Europe and beyond. In Siberia, Central Powers prisoners endured freezing temperatures and long isolation. In Germany, Allied prisoners labored in farms and factories. Yet captivity was not uniform misery. Some camps developed cultural life, orchestras, theaters, even universities. The Danish Red Cross facilitated inspections and aid deliveries, highlighting early efforts at international humanitarian oversight. The war exposed both the brutality and the emerging frameworks of prisoner rights. In the Balkans, the very region where the war had ignited, devastation reached catastrophic levels. Serbia suffered proportionately one of the highest casualty rates of any nation in the conflict. After repelling Austria-Hungary in 1914, Serbia was invaded again in 1915 by a combined force of German, Austro-Hungarian, and Bulgarian troops. The Serbian army, along with thousands of civilians, retreated through the mountains of Albania in what became known as the Great Retreat. Survivors described starvation, frostbite, and relentless attacks. Of roughly 400,000 who began the retreat, tens of thousands perished before reaching the Adriatic coast. It was one of the war's great human tragedies, and yet remains far less discussed than battles in France.
Then there were the mutinies, cracks in the discipline of industrial warfare. In 1917, after the disastrous Nivelle offensive, French soldiers began refusing orders to attack. Entire units stayed in their trenches, unwilling to participate in what they saw as suicidal offensives. General Philippe Pétain restored order not only through punishment, though several ringleaders were executed, but also by improving leave policies and living conditions. The French army did not collapse, it adapted. But the mutinies revealed a deeper truth. Patriotism had limits when faced with mechanized slaughter. On the Eastern Front, the Russian Empire was unraveling. The strain of war intensified food shortages, inflation, and political unrest. Soldiers deserted in massive numbers. In 1917, revolution erupted. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, ending centuries of Romanov rule. Later that year, the Bolsheviks seized power under Vladimir Lenin, promising peace, land, and bread. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918 removed Russia from the war, but at enormous territorial cost. The First World War did not just topple governments, it birthed an entirely new ideological state that would shape the 20th century, the Soviet Union. The Ottoman Empire, meanwhile, faced internal collapse as well. Among the darkest chapters of the war was the Armenian genocide. Beginning in 1915, Ottoman authorities deported and massacred Armenians, accusing them of collaborating with Russian forces. Forced marches into the Syrian desert led to mass starvation and death. Contemporary diplomatic reports from American and European observers documented systematic atrocities. An estimated 1 to 1.5 million Armenians perished. Though overshadowed in many general accounts of the war, this genocide stands as one of the conflict's most devastating human catastrophes. Even at sea, beyond the famous submarine campaigns, lesser-known naval episodes unfolded. In 1916, the Battle of Jutland became the largest naval clash of the war between Britain's Grand Fleet and Germany's High Seas Fleet. Tactically inconclusive, strategically it maintained British naval dominance, but what often goes unnoticed is how close Germany came to breaking Britain's blockade strategy. The naval arms race that preceded the war had created massive dreadnought battleships, floating symbols of industrial might. Yet these giants spent much of the war waiting, restrained by the risk of catastrophic loss. The war at sea became as much about blockade and starvation as direct confrontation. The British naval blockade of Germany had profound consequences. By restricting imports of food and raw materials, it contributed to severe shortages among German civilians. The winter of 1916-1917 became known as the turnip winter. With potato crops failing and supplies scarce, many Germans survived on animal feed and turnips meant for livestock. Malnutrition spread. Civilian deaths linked to starvation and disease reached into the hundreds of thousands. The war was not confined to battlefields, it entered kitchens and dining tables. Another fact often overlooked is how the war reshaped global labor movements. Colonial troops from India, Africa, the Caribbean, Australia, and New Zealand fought in Europe and the Middle East. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served overseas. They fought at Ypres, Gallipoli, and in Mesopotamia. Letters home, many censored, described alien landscapes and brutal fighting. Exposure to European politics and the rhetoric of self-determination fueled post-war independence movements. The war that was meant to defend empires ultimately weakened them. And then there was Gallipoli. In 1915, Allied forces attempted to seize the Dardanelles Strait to open a supply route to Russia and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war.
The campaign became a brutal stalemate of cliffs, trenches, and disease. Australian and New Zealand troops, the Anzacs, suffered heavy casualties. The evacuation in early 1916 was one of the few successfully executed operations of the campaign. Gallipoli became a foundational national memory for Australia and New Zealand, shaping their emerging identities separate from Britain. Technological innovation continued relentlessly. Tanks made their battlefield debut in 1916 at the Somme. Early models were slow, mechanically unreliable, and terrifying in appearance. German soldiers reportedly fled at the sight of these armored machines crawling across no man's land. Though primitive, tanks represented a shift towards mobile warfare, a hint of the mechanized conflicts yet to come. Aircraft, once used primarily for reconnaissance, evolved into instruments of combat. Dogfights between fighter races like Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, captured public imagination. Pilots were romanticized as knights of the sky, even as casualty rates soared. The air war introduced strategic bombing of cities, blurring the line between military and civilian targets. Meanwhile, the 1918 influenza pandemic emerged in the final year of the war, infecting soldiers and civilians alike. Troop movements accelerated its global spread. The pandemic killed more people worldwide than the war itself. Camps and trenches became breeding grounds for disease. Yet censorship in wartime nations suppressed reporting, while neutral Spain's open press coverage led to the misleading name Spanish flu. As 1918 unfolded, exhaustion defined every front. Germany launched a final series of offensives in the spring, hoping to defeat the Allies before American forces arrived in full strength. Initially successful, the offensives ultimately overstretched German lines. When the Allied counteroffensive began in August, the 100 Days Offensive, German forces retreated steadily. Behind the lines, political collapse accelerated. Austria-Hungary fragmented into nationalist movements. The Ottoman Empire crumbled. Germany faced revolution at home. Sailors mutinied at Kiel. Workers struck in Berlin. On November 11, 1918, an armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the Compiègne forest. But peace did not mean stability. The war had destroyed 4 empires: German, Austria-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian. Borders were redrawn with little regard for ethnic complexity. The world that emerged from the First World War was fragile, resentful, and deeply scarred. And yet, there is more beneath the surface: secret intelligence operations, economic warfare, forgotten uprisings, and the profound psychological aftermath that would shape an entire generation.
When the guns finally began to fall silent in late 1918, the world was exhausted, but it was not at peace. Beneath the formal surrender documents and victory parades lay unfinished business, secret operations, shattered psyches, and political decisions that would ripple across decades. To understand the true legacy of the First World War, we must look beyond the armistice and into the hidden consequences already unfolding. One of the least discussed aspects of the war was the scale and sophistication of espionage. Intelligence networks operated in every major capital. In Britain, Room 40, a secret cryptanalysis unit of the Admiralty, intercepted and decoded German communications. It was Room 40 that deciphered the Zimmermann telegram in 1917, revealing Germany's proposal of a military alliance with Mexico against the United States. When the contents were shared with Washington, American public opinion shifted dramatically. What is often overlooked is how delicate the operation was. Britain had to reveal the telegram without exposing that it had broken German codes. Intelligence manipulation became an art form, secrecy layered upon secrecy. Germany, too, ran extensive spy networks in the United States before American entry into the war. Sabotage operations targeted factories and shipping facilities supplying the Allies. In 1916, a massive explosion at the Black Tom Munitions Depot in New Jersey, widely believed to be the work of German agents, shattered windows in Manhattan and damaged the Statue of Liberty.
It remains one of the largest acts of sabotage on American soil before the modern era. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, the collapse of empires created a vacuum filled with chaos. As Austria-Hungary disintegrated, new nations emerged almost overnight: Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and an expanded Romania. But these states were mosaics of ethnic groups with competing claims. Borders were drawn at the Paris Peace Conference by men who had rarely visited the territories they divided. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson championed the principle of national self-determination, yet its application was inconsistent. Millions found themselves minorities in newly formed states, fueling grievances that would later erupt again. In Germany, the end of the war triggered what many perceived as betrayal. The armistice was signed while German troops were still on foreign soil, not yet invaded. When the Treaty of Versailles was finalized in 1919, it imposed territorial losses, military restrictions, and heavy reparations. Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, assigned responsibility to the war to Germany and its allies. Though the reality of blame was far more complex, this clause became a lightning rod for anger. Many Germans believed they had been stabbed in the back by politicians and revolutionaries at home, rather than defeated on the battlefield. That narrative would later be exploited with devastating effect. The Treaty of Versailles also redrew Europe's map in ways that appeared logical on paper, but fragile in practice. Poland was resurrected as an independent state after more than a century of partition. Yet the Polish corridor, granting access to the Baltic Sea, separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The city of Danzig became a free city under League of Nations supervision. These arrangements were diplomatic compromises, but they left lingering resentment. The League of Nations itself was one of the war's most ambitious yet fragile creations. Conceived as a mechanism to prevent future conflicts through collective security, it embodied the hope that diplomacy could replace total war. But from its inception, it was weakened. The U.S. Senate refused to ratify membership, leaving the League without the participation of one of the world's rising powers. Enforcement mechanisms were limited. The dream of a new international order stood on uncertain ground. Beyond Europe, the Middle East underwent a transformation whose effects are still felt today. The Ottoman Empire's Arab provinces were divided into mandates under British and French control. Iraq and Lebanon fell under British administration, Syria and Lebanon under French authority. The language of mandates suggested temporary stewardship towards independence. In practice, it often meant continued imperial control. Promises made during the war to Arab leaders and separately to Zionist representatives in the Balfour Declaration collided in a landscape of rising nationalist aspirations. The contradictions embedded in these agreements ensured that the region would remain unstable. The human toll of the war extended far beyond physical casualties. An entire generation carried invisible wounds. Shell shock, once misunderstood and stigmatized, left countless veterans struggling with nightmares, tremors, and depression. Some were institutionalized. Others were executed during the war for desertion or cowardice before psychological trauma was properly understood. After 1918, societies were confronted with men who had survived the trenches but were permanently altered. War memorials rose in cities and villages across Europe, not only as monuments to the dead, but as silent acknowledgments of collective trauma. The cultural impact was equally profound. Artists and writers grappled with disillusionment. The romantic ideals of honor and glory collapsed under the weight of industrial slaughter. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon wrote stark verses describing gas attacks and shattered bodies. Their words stripped away illusions and revealed war's raw brutality. In Germany, the lost generation questioned authority and tradition. Across Europe, faith in institutions weakened. Economically, the war had transformed global power balances. The United States emerged as a creditor nation, while European powers were heavily indebted. The financial strain contributed to instability during the 1920s. Hyperinflation in Germany in 1923 wiped out savings and fueled extremism. In Russia, civil war raged between Bolsheviks and anti-communist forces until 1921, leaving millions dead from fighting and famine. The war didn't truly end in 1918. In many regions, violence continued for years. Another rarely discussed dimension was the environmental impact. Entire regions of northeastern France and Belgium were rendered uninhabitable. The Zone Rouge in France, still marked today, contained unexploded shells and contaminated soil. Farmers returning to their land found craters, barbed wire, and poison residue. The scars of trench systems remained visible from the air decades later. Even technology left complicated legacies. Advances in aviation, communications, and motorized transport accelerated modernization, but the same innovations that connected the world also enhanced its capacity for destruction. Chemical weapons, though condemned, had been unleashed. Tanks had proven their battlefield value. Strategic bombing had begun. The blueprint for 20th century warfare had been drafted.
And then there were the quieter, almost forgotten uprisings that erupted in the war's aftermath. In Ireland, the Easter Rising of 1916 and the subsequent War of Independence were influenced by Britain's wartime vulnerabilities. In India, returning soldiers and economic strain intensified demands for self-rule. Across Africa and Asia, colonial subjects questioned why they had fought for empires that denied them equality. The rhetoric of freedom and democracy, so central to Allied propaganda, reverberated globally. Perhaps one of the most ironic outcomes of the war was how it normalized state control over everyday life. Governments had implemented rationing systems, censorship, conscription, and economic planning on an unprecedented scale. Many of these mechanisms persisted after the war. The modern bureaucratic state expanded rapidly during these years, shaping governments long into the future. The war also altered time itself. Daylight saving time was widely adopted to conserve fuel. Standardized time zones and coordinated rail schedules became even more essential. The synchronization required for total war influenced civilian infrastructure. Yet, even amid devastation, moments of humanity endured. Letters between soldiers and families reveal tenderness, humor, and longing. In the final hours before the armistice on November 11, 1918, fighting continued. Tragically, thousands were killed on the very day peace was declared, some just minutes before 11 a.m. The machinery of war did not stop instantly. It ground forward until the final second. As crowds celebrated in Paris, London, and New York, many soldiers stood silent. They had seen too much. The armistice was relief, not triumph. But history would prove that the peace was incomplete. Beneath the treaties and ceremonies lay unresolved grievances, fragile democracies, and ideological extremes gaining traction. The Great War was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Instead, it became the prelude. When the armistice came into effect at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, church bells rang across Europe. Crowds flooded the streets of Paris and London. Soldiers embraced, flags waved. Yet even in that moment of celebration, the shadow of what had been unleashed lingered heavily over the world. One of the least spoken realities of the First World War is that fighting did not immediately stop everywhere. In Eastern Europe, chaos continued. Civil wars, border conflicts, and revolutions erupted across territories once held together by collapsing empires. In Russia, the Bolsheviks consolidated power through brutal civil war that lasted until 1921. In the Baltic states, wars of independence unfolded. In parts of the former Ottoman Empire, violence persisted as nationalist movements clashed with occupying forces. For many, the end of the war was simply a transition into new conflicts. Even more striking is the fact that some soldiers were killed on the very morning of November 11th, hours and even minutes before the ceasefire. At 10:59 a.m., Henry Gunther was killed while charging a German machine gun position despite the imminent end of hostilities. German soldiers reportedly tried to wave him back, knowing the armistice was about to take effect. His death symbolizes the tragic inertia of industrial war. Once in motion, it was difficult to halt. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919 in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, was intended to formalize peace. But for Germany, the ceremony felt like humiliation layered upon defeat. The choice of location was deliberate. It was in that same hall that the German Empire had been proclaimed in 71 after victory over France. Now, nearly 48 years later, Germany was compelled to accept punitive terms in the very place of its earlier triumph. The reparations imposed on Germany were staggering. Though the total sum would later be adjusted, the economic burden contributed to deep instability. In 1923, when Germany fell behind on payments, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr industrial region. Passive resistance by German workers and the government's decision to print money to support striking laborers led to hyperinflation. Photographs from the time showed Germans carrying wheelbarrows full of banknotes to buy bread. Savings evaporated. Middle-class families were ruined. Economic despair became fertile ground for extremism. Yet the consequences of the war extended beyond Germany. Austria-Hungary, once a vast, multi-ethnic empire, fragmented into smaller states struggling to survive economically. Austria itself, reduced to a small republic, faced severe hardship. Hungary underwent revolution and counter-revolution. The delicate balance that had once existed in Central Europe was replaced by fragile, competing nation-states. The Ottoman Empire's dissolution was equally transformative. The Turkish War of Independence, led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, rejected the harsh terms imposed by the Treaty of Sèvres. By 1923, the modern Republic of Turkey emerged after renegotiation under the Treaty of Lausanne. But elsewhere in the former empire, borders drawn by European powers ignored ethnic and sectarian realities. The mandate system in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine created new political entities whose internal tensions were not resolved, only managed. The long-term instability of the Middle East can trace many of its roots directly back to the First World War. Another rarely discussed legacy of the war is how it reshaped global pandemics and public health policy. The 1918 influenza pandemic, which killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide, was accelerated by troop movements and crowded military camps. Governments that had censored bad news during the war were slow to report the spread of the disease. In many cities, influenza overwhelmed hospitals just as soldiers were returning home. The pandemic blurred the line between wartime and peacetime suffering. Culturally, the war shattered old certainties. Monarchies that had ruled for centuries fell within 4 years. The Romanovs in Russia, the Hohenzollerns in Germany, the Habsburgs in Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans in Constantinople. The collapse of these dynasties marked the end of an era. In their place emerged republics, fragile democracies, and revolutionary regimes. Political ideologies hardened. Communism spread in the East. Fascism would soon rise in the West.
The war also transformed technology into an everyday presence. Aviation, which had matured rapidly during combat, transitioned into civilian air travel. Radio communication advanced. Mass production techniques, refined during wartime, expanded into consumer industries. Yet these same technologies would later be adapted again for even more destructive purposes. Socially, the war accelerated change. Women who had filled industrial jobs during the conflict did not entirely return to pre-war roles. In several countries, including Britain and the United States, women gained the right to vote in the years following the war. The upheaval of total war had disrupted traditional gender hierarchies. And then there were the veterans, millions of men returning home with visible and invisible scars. Organizations formed to advocate for their rights. Memorials were erected in towns large and small. The unknown soldier became a powerful symbol, representing countless bodies never identified. In 1920, Britain and France both interred unknown soldiers in prominent national monuments. These tombs became sites of remembrance, acknowledging the scale of loss that statistics alone could never capture. Perhaps one of the most haunting truths is how the war normalized the idea of total war, the mobilization of entire societies for conflict. Civilians were no longer distant observers, they were workers, targets, participants. Economic warfare, propaganda campaigns, and strategic bombing blurred the boundaries between battlefield and home front. This transformation meant that future wars would not be confined to trenches. And indeed, less than 21 years after the armistice, Europe would once again descend into catastrophe. Many historians argue that the Second World War was not a separate conflict, but a continuation, an unresolved sequel to the first. The grievances of Versailles, the economic turmoil of the 1920s, and the ideological polarization of the interwar years created conditions ripe for renewed conflict. But beyond geopolitics and treaties lies a deeper legacy. The First World War changed how humanity understood itself. It shattered the illusion that industrial progress guaranteed moral progress. It revealed that science and technology could magnify destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. It forced societies to confront trauma, to redefine citizenship, to question authority. In letters written decades later, veterans often described the war not just as an event, but as a dividing line in their lives, before 1914 and after 1918. The world that existed before the war, confident, imperial, convinced of its own permanence, had vanished. In its place stood a modern age defined by uncertainty. And yet, within that uncertainty, there were lessons. The attempt to build international institutions, flawed as it was, represented a recognition that cooperation was necessary. Humanitarian law advanced. The memory of the trenches became a warning. The First World War was not only a story of mud and machine guns, it was a story of hidden campaigns in Africa and Asia, of coded telegrams and secret treaties, of mutinies and revolutions, of propaganda and pandemics, of empires collapsing and nations being born. It was a war that reshaped borders, identities, technologies, and ideologies. Many of its most important consequences were not immediately visible in 1918. They unfolded slowly, shaping the 20th century in profound ways. If you've stayed with this documentary until now, you've traveled through some of the lesser-known realities of the Great War, stories often overshadowed by the better-known battles of the Western Front. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these little-discussed facts surprised you the most? Was it the underground mine explosions, the African campaigns, the secret intelligence operations, or the political decisions that planted the seeds of future wars? Comment the word armistice below so I know you made it to the very end. Share your thoughts about what you found most fascinating. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden dimensions of World War I, make sure to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and continue watching the videos that are appearing on your screen right now. There are many more untold stories waiting to be uncovered.